On the Zero Hour, I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. I haven't talked to my next guest in a little while, and I always appreciate speaking with him about including a variety of topics, but among other things, the state of journalism and the state of our understanding of journalism. Matt Taibbi is a columnist. He is an author whose books include Insane Clown President, mad props for that title, and Hate Incorporated, about the modern media. He also has a Substack, if I can say that quickly, presence, known as a columnist for Rolling Stone as well. And he has a podcast that I believe is called Useful Idiots, but I hope my memory.
That's right.
Short-circuited me there. So Matt, enough of me. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back on.
Oh, it's always great talking with you. And I wanted to start with this. This, like clockwork, seems. First of all, I'm going to say, preface this by saying, I think you're writing now about social media and people's ability to speak their minds on social media. I was going to respond to you on Twitter to something, this engagement that's been going on that I'm about to bring up, but I have been off Twitter for 5 weeks and Twitter won't respond to me. So
really,
pardon?
Really? Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And they say it's because, well, my account got hacked. And then I tried to get it back. I've never been able to get it back, and they won't respond to me. So 5 weeks is a long time. But so I couldn't engage with you on Twitter about it. But it seems as if this comes up like clockwork, which is that every time the name Julian Assange is mentioned, for example, on social media, a lot of people want to step in and say basically variations of, I hate that guy. He's not a real journalist. I hope he gets what's coming to him, which in this case is years of extreme torture. And I mean, just this savagery, but it's not coming from the far right. It's coming by and large from people who would probably describe themselves as liberal Democrats. So I see you've been engaged in or on the receiving end of some of that lately, and I think it's such an important topic that I want to revisit it again. So I want to talk about that, maybe a couple other things that come up.
Sure.
First of all, don't you ever get discouraged of just fighting this battle over and over?
A little bit, but I do think that that there's a lot of popular support for civil liberties, for free speech, and I think some of the sort of new strident attitude towards removing certain people from view or villainizing certain folks, I think some of it is heightened artificially by Twitter, by the media presence. I think that there's an overrepresentation of a certain kind of view in commercial press about a lot of these things. So I do get discouraged, but I also think that that I'm not necessarily swimming upstream about a lot of this stuff. I think a lot of what we're dealing with some of these new attitudes is a pretty small number of people who just happen to be in positions of influence in the news media. So it's discouraging, but not to total despair, I would say.
So, okay, fair enough. I think there's how do I put it? I think there's also another force of probably overrepresented on Twitter, where I'm no longer welcome, apparently, and other social media, of people who, the people I described, the individuals who loathe Assange and anyone who dares to bring up the issue of press freedom in proximity to the matter of Julian Assange. But briefly, I mean, this is a guy who's been detained now. All charges have been dropped against him in Sweden, which was the original pretext for his being detained and seeking asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And now he's being pursued by the U.S. government to be tried on charges here, right? I've basically got all that right.
Yes, and the charges that they want to have him extradited to face in the United States are extremely serious, to put it mildly. And there are a lot of misconceptions about what those charges are. The two things that people get most confused about, a lot of people seem to think it has something to do with 2016 and helping the Russians or hacking the DNC. It doesn't. This is a very, very old case that's really based upon two principles. One is that he's being accused of conspiring to aid in the cracking of a hash, which would have allowed then Private Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, to evade detection as she found classified materials that she wanted to send to Assange. But the much more serious issue in the indictment, it's 17 of the 18 counts, has to do with this pretty radical concept of obtaining and conveying national defense information, which would, if he's convicted on those charges, essentially what they're saying is just by virtue of having access to and putting hands on the classified material that Manning provided, Assange was guilty of a felony. If he gets convicted on that, that basically criminalizes what people, who have my job do as a matter of routine. It's pretty common to have classified material discussed with sources. Whistleblowers will come forward with things all the time. If it becomes criminal to even see or talk about those things, then we're in pretty serious trouble. And I think I guess what I struggle with is that people who dislike Assange and hate him for whatever reason can't see the larger issue there, which is just really frightening for all of us.
Well, and it seems to me that that if I were, and I don't mean to sound conspiratorial, but bearing in mind that under Democratic as well as Republican presidents, especially under Obama and now Trump, that Obama accelerated dramatically the use of charges against journalists.
The Espionage Act. Mm-hmm.
The Espionage Act, most notably, I believe, James Risen, then of the New York Times, now of The Intercept. A lot of people react when you start charging a New York Times reporter with espionage. So, and again, I'm not necessarily thinking conspiratorially, but just hypothetically speaking, if I were a national security official and I wanted to normalize in the United States of America the idea that you prosecute people for doing journalism, I would make sure my first prosecution was a widely loathed figure, especially a figure who was disliked by liberals. And if they didn't exist, I would take a prominent figure who was not part of the journalistic mainstream and make sure they were despised. And if that person turned out to be Julian Assange, I would then make him my first prosecution under the broadest possible interpretations of the law, normalize it. And then, first they came for, the guy
Right.
with the cat in the embassy. And now, then they came for me, kind of thing. And it just strikes me as insidious from top to bottom, because who says he's not a journalist? And if you can't come up with a reason why he's not a journalist, he wasn't working for a foreign power, even though Mike Pompeo says that, he considers Wikipedia a foreign intelligence service. He could have said that about the New York Times or anybody else. I really don't get how people don't get that the attack on Julian Assange is an attack on journalism itself.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is part of a larger trend that really worries me a lot, which is that when people try to think about broad issues they over-focus now, it feels like to me, on individuals involved, and if it's a person that they don't like, that's the deciding factor for them. They just can't see past that. Um, I think it was a major factor in a lot of the Russiagate stories. People just hated Donald Trump, so they couldn't look past to see there were a lot of really troubling civil liberties issues going on there with the investigation of Trump, and we're seeing some of that come out now. But because it was Trump, and because we were talking about people like Paul Manafort or Michael Flynn, nobody wanted to hear about any of that because they just wanted to get that person. So same with Assange. And I think you're right. If this prosecution had been aimed at a prominent New York Times reporter, and they had gone through with it that way, it would have been less popular. So yes, Assange is kind of the perfect person to normalize this kind of prosecution. I mean, I think you could look similarly at episodes like the removal of Alex Jones from the internet. When that happened, right. I mean, who doesn't hate Alex Jones? Everybody hates Alex Jones, right?
Right.
But as I pointed out at the time, the mechanics of how that happened were extremely troubling and had very serious implications for people across the political spectrum. But nobody wanted to hear it because it's Alex Jones, So I think this is like a feature of politics today in the internet age. People just can't seem to get past the personalities to what the larger problem is.
I think, Matt Taibbi, I think you're 100% right. And I also think that besides personalities, there's a huge dose of tribalism in it. And I guess, I probably shouldn't use that word because it has ethnocentric implications. But what I mean by it, and this may be team, hyper loyalty or something is a better term. But, if I say I'm a Democrat and I'm on Team Blue, Julian Assange leaked Democratic emails that made my party and my candidate look bad. So torture him all you want. I mean, that to me, or the argument that I hear from certain members of Team Blue, culturally speaking, whatever, affinity speaking, is why did he never leak things about Republicans? Which, first of all, I think he did. But secondly, it's still journalism. You can report on the foible. I'm telling you like you don't know, but you can report solely on the foibles of Donald Trump. But as long as you're investigating, or the Republican Party, as long as you're bringing facts to light and publishing them for the public, in my view, you're a journalist. So it's not a legitimate critique to say, well, you're not a journalist because you only report about Republicans. You get what I'm trying to say, right?
Absolutely. And, I think furthermore, if you had polled reporters 40 years ago about their attitudes about this sort of thing, pretty universally, you would have gotten from people in the press this idea that we support reporting across the political spectrum as long as it's true. Like, that was always the important point for people in this business was, are you telling the truth or are you not? Beyond that, we don't really care. Like, it's our job to just bring you facts. And traditionally, the view of the press is, the free press is, we just bring you this stuff, and then society makes decisions about the information that we give to you. Now there's a new emphasis now where journalists are supposed to be thinking before the point of publication, what's the impact of this material going to be, and who is it going to help and who is it going to hurt? And so that's where they're being judged is on the political value of the information that's coming out. In the case of Assange, it's always blown my mind that there has been so much vituperation about what happened in 2016 because the leaks were of true facts. I mean, those emails were real. They weren't fake news. That was real stuff, and it was clearly in the public interest. The court has ruled it's in the public interest. It's protected in that sense. There's a court case, the Supreme Court case called Bartnicki v. Vopper, that holds that you can publish things that are even stolen as long as it's in the public interest, which this clearly was. And once upon a time, that kind of activity would have had the universal support of people in the press community, and that's no longer true, and I think it's really troubling.
Yeah, and again, we're talking with Matt Taibbi about issues of press freedom, and especially around Julian Assange. I was just thinking as you were talking, the great muckrakers who every journalist is taught rightfully to respect, whether it's Lincoln Steffens, Shame of the Cities, or Jacob Hein, or whomever. They only reported about poor people being unhappy, which was clearly ideological. Why didn't they report about rich people being unhappy too? So that we, you could take this to an extreme, but my point, Matt, is you're absolutely right. You described it perfectly. I think we have this slanted, ideological take now on how you have to balance everything. And Assange, the trial of Assange is the point of the spear on that. But you would agree, I'm sure, because you've written a book on it, that this viewpoint, it doesn't just reflect itself in something like the Assange prosecution, but on the front page of every major newspaper and in the content of every broadcast. This idea that not only doesn't it only matter that you're reporting facts, but to me, it's not even the primary factor now. In terms of content, other than the obvious, commercial viability or whatever, the main thing is, have you represented the points of view, if it's political reporting, of the two major parties, regardless of whether either or both of them is correct? Am I being unfair?
No, and I think we may have talked about this before, but I started to worry about this in the summer of 2016, when in the New York Times there was a very influential editorial by a guy named Jim Rutenberg, who wrote a piece called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity." I think was the title of the article, and essentially what he said was that Trump was so bad and was such a threat to democracy that we as journalists had to rethink our ideas of what objectivity meant, and that we had to no longer just worry about being true, but being true to history's judgment. And this was a profound change in how we look at the job. It was only one editorial, but I think it actually was extremely significant because it represented a very major sort of sea change within the business about how we thought about these things. In other words, now when we were publishing things, we know we couldn't just worry about whether this was factually correct or not. We had to worry about the impact and who it was helping, and moreover, there was a clear side that we had to be helping. And sort of my argument about that was always, that this is a total misunderstanding of the role of the media. Like the media's job is already extremely hard. Just being able to report things that are true and making sure that you're accurate, that is an extremely difficult job. It's a very hard job to do quickly, which is the job of investigative reporters. And if we have to start adding political considerations into that work, it inevitably backfires on us. We're inevitably terrible at it also, I should point out. And I think we're betraying our audiences. Like it's an expression of distrust in the audience. What we're really saying to the audience is, we don't trust you to be able to handle just the raw facts. We're going to tell you also how to consume those facts. And I think it's arrogant and it's dangerous as well, but it's now kind of the norm in the business.
Well, I'm not sure you and I ever did talk about the Jim Rutenberg piece, but it certainly is appalling. Yet at the same time, it makes explicit what's been implicit in a lot of the reporting. I've read certainly over the past several years, and there's something else about it which is disturbing, which is that rather than being fact-driven, you might describe it as moving from fact-driven to outcome-driven, with at least the way I'm interpreting the way you described it, meaning that, for example, it's an objective fact now that the Trump presidency is worse than any possible alternative political outcome, and that therefore we will be judged by the extent to which we limited the likelihood of, for example, a Trump reelection or whatever, which I may personally and do personally fervently wish for, but I don't think news desks, editors should be assigning stories based on their political, necessarily on their partisan political outcome. And for example, if Trump turns out to be, let's say, less extreme than his Democratic predecessors on the way he wants to negotiate trade deals, that means that as a journalist, I can't report that because I'll be judged by history as having said something favorable about Trump that might have enabled his reelection, for example, even if objectively the jobs lost in his revision of NAFTA might be less than the jobs lost under the original NAFTA negotiated by Bill Clinton. You get what I'm saying, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I think you're 100% right. Again, I was raised in the business to believe very passionately that telling the truth is always socially beneficial, and that this had to be the sort of operating principle of the job. Again, this is a difficult job. If you don't have an operating principle in this job, it's really not an easy one. And this idea that worrying about the outcome is going to help more than just telling people the truth, I think is a deeply flawed one. And we can see countless examples of that in the last 4 years. I mean, the first time I was really brought face to face with it was in the summer of 2016 when I started to hear journalists talking about not reporting the fact that was obvious to all of us, which was that Hillary Clinton was just not drawing very large crowds, and that there was a huge disparity in enthusiasm and between what we were seeing on the Democratic campaign trail and on the Trump side. And a lot of reporters sort of sat on that information, or if they did report it, they always reported it in the context of some excuse that was given to them by the Clinton campaign, like, oh, we're not emphasizing big population centers, or I don't even. You have to go back and look, but you'll see that it was either very lightly reported or always reported as not significant. In fact, it was extremely significant. Same thing with poll numbers that indicated things that would have been troubling. There were polls, for instance, that showed that there were high numbers of people who had unfavorable views of both candidates, and therefore that left a high degree of uncertainty about how they would vote in November, because it was impossible to judge how people who felt negatively about both sides, which way they would go. But a lot of those poll numbers were ignored. I heard a lot of colleagues talking about how we can't say this, report this or that, because it'll look like it's helping Trump or it's good news for Trump. But so what ends up happening with that is I think that contributed to voter apathy, because people were so sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win that, that there might have been, who knows, maybe it's only 10,000 people didn't show up to vote because of that kind of attitude, but that's might have been significant, So I think we always get into trouble when we do this, and now it's just rampant. It's not even an exception here and there. It's basically everything you see on TV and in the front pages. It's very troubling.
Yeah, and Matt Taibbi, this gets into a phrase that you picked up on, and it caught my eye too, in a piece. And we don't need to get sidetracked. I don't think either of us are prepared to render an opinion on Ronan Farrow, but Ben seems to me he's done some good work. I don't know the details, but of Ben Smith's critique. But Ben Smith, formerly editor of BuzzFeed, now at New York Times, wrote a big piece basically critiquing Ronan Farrow's methods. But in the course of writing that piece, he talked about a phenomenon called, which he called resistance journalism. And while, again, I'm agnostic on his claims about Ronan Farrow, that phrase struck me as potentially on the money. And I was curious to know, you mentioned it on that platform to which I'm no longer allowed to, but I take it caught your eye too.
Yeah, and Glenn Greenwald also wrote a long piece about this as well. I am with you on Ronan Farrow. To be honest, I just haven't paid a whole lot of attention to his
Yeah.
To what the specifics of his complaints about Ronan Farrow might have been. I don't have any feelings about that one way or the other. But what he was describing, and there's an irony here, which I'll get to in a second. What he's describing is this phenomenon where it's now permitted to be factually sloppy or to leave out context that otherwise we would have put in, as long as the targets are the correct ones. All right. So the overarching concept is as long as we're doing something that's negative about Trump, if the facts end up not quite lining up, or if it turns out we probably should have dug a little bit more before we published something, whatever, because the intent was the right one. You're going after Trump. You're going, which helps the quote unquote resistance. So that's okay. And this has led to all sorts of problems. While I agree with Smith about that larger point, the irony is that he was the person who was behind the decision to publish the Steele dossier,
Right.
which was a major departure from sort of journalistic norms, because we normally we normally don't publish things that we can't verify. And Smith, when he was at BuzzFeed, even wrote in the letter explaining his decision that we actively have doubts about a lot of the material, but we're going to publish it anyway. And I think that exemplified that stance, because if it were not about Donald Trump, I can't see that would have been a decision that would have been cheered by the journalistic community.
Yeah, and I always, by the way, or not always, but I often perform that sort of mental exercise as a self-test, and the Steele dossier is a perfect example of it. If a news outlet had published this about a politician I like, what would my reaction be? Unsubstantiated, lurid, accusations, later turns out, paid for by the opposing campaign. My reaction wouldn't be good. And there's also something else in this field of resistance journalism that I think happens a lot. You mentioned that sometimes they don't provide the proper, qualification to a story. Like, some have claimed that this file went missing, and others dispute that assertion or say it could have been done in the normal course of blah, 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 right? But there's also, and sometimes they'll leave out that qualification, which I think is misleading journalism, but there'll also be something that's like a contextual sleight of hand. I mean, I think you and I have both been around long enough to know when in a 5,000 word piece, a paragraph is dropped in 3/4 of the way down that says, of course, it's always possible that this file was just shifted as a result of routine procedure. And then goes back to like the sensationalistic. So there they may have dotted their I and crossed their T, but they presented it in such a way that it's still resistance journalism, because it's going to give Rachel a headline for tonight, or it's going to do something else. The reader's going to walk away thinking, man, there's something really dirty going on here. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great example of that was in the first week of 2017, when Trump was the president-elect, and the four chiefs of the intelligence world, James Clapper, John Brennan, James Comey, and Mike Rogers of the NSA, they had a briefing with Donald Trump where they presented him with the information in the Steele dossier, ostensibly to let him know that there was this blackmail material out there, and to reassure him that they weren't going to provide news agencies with a hook to publish this stuff. And then within days, the word of that meeting was leaked to all the major news organizations, and they ran the story. Now, see, the interesting thing here is that most of the news organizations had the Steele reports already, but they weren't publishing them for the very perfectly good reason that they couldn't confirm this stuff. But once they had the news that there had been this briefing, now they could take this kind of detour, which is something that I've encountered in financial journalism, which I can get to later. where you're reporting on the journey of the allegations as opposed to the allegations themselves,
Yeah.
right? So you're saying that one person presented the allegations to another set of another person, and that allowed them to stick this in print. Now, they did, CNN in its first report, they did say, oh, incidentally, none of this has been confirmed, and the FBI hasn't been able to, provide any corroboration. But here are some of the things that, and so it's an end run around the normal, yeah.
Matt, I just invented a term for it while you were describing it, which is you may hate it, but it's the meta news dodge. It's basically the news itself is not legitimate, but the fact that it's about to become news is news. Right. Therefore, I'm going to report that there is a story that may or may not be legitimate, but I'm reporting it to you because the presence of the story makes it a story.
That's right. That's right. Right. Yes. I think I've heard it called reporting the controversy before. That's another way. Like if remember that story a million years ago when Bush and Kerry had a debate, and there was this rumor that Bush had was getting his answers in the debate signaled to him, right? Because he had a bulge under his jacket. And the New York Times did a front page story in the column A1, like prime real estate in American journalism, right? Like about the fact that people were talking about the fact that Bush might have been given the answers by this transmitter. Now, nobody had any actual information that this was true, but they just they made it into like what you call a reader, right? It was a feature that was sort of half lighthearted about, hey, maybe this is true and folks are talking about it, which is kind of a version of what Trump does all the time, which, hey, people are saying, that this is true. And but you're right, that meta news dodge, once upon a time it was pretty rare, and now it's just like the norm. It's, as soon as things happen on social media, that you can instantly report on the fact that it's a talked about thing.
Well, and it's the perfect way to skew the news according to your political or other interests. I mean, I would be curious to look back at a couple major news outlets and see how many meta news stories there have been about Trump versus, for example, Joe Biden. And it seems to me that, and I don't want to go down this pathway necessarily, but it seems to me that if anything, there's been a reluctance on the part of some of the same news agencies to delve into unsubstantiated charges or hard to substantiate charges about Biden. And I don't want them to. I don't want them to do it with anyone. But it seems to me that, let's put it this way, so I don't go down this road myself. I would be very interested in an analysis that, looks into whether this has been deployed in a specific way.
Yeah, and I think if you ask conservatives what's their take on that, they'll say 100% this is done to us, routinely, and not as much to Democratic Party politicians.
Well, as a guy who was Bernie's chief writer in 2015, 2016, I can tell you it was done to us too. But
of course. Yep.
I don't big time, but I don't see it, I just don't see it being done to the more established figures in the Democratic Party, he said carefully. And, I'd be curious about an analysis. That's all I'm going to say.
And just to bring up the Bernie thing, you're out, like, that's a perfect example of what we're talking about with Bernie. It's, there are allegations of sexism, or, it's the reputation, that he has, or people on social media are, or the Bernie bros, the troll phenomenon. We're talking about impossible to quantify, difficult to identify stories. Like, we don't know who those trolls are. They're anonymous. We don't know who they like, who's writing that stuff. And yet, what news organizations were doing with that story was saying there is a perception of this thing that is a problem for Bernie Sanders, and we're going to keep talking about it over and over, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy very quickly, right? if you're saying a candidate is dogged by accusations, which is one of those journalistic phrases,
Right.
you're willing that story into being, and that's very easy to do, and we all know it. But it's just done more often with certain kinds of politicians than others.
Yeah, and I think it's an enforcement of social norms like anything else. So, Matt Taibbi, I guess I'm trying to think of a good closing hook for this, but to me, it's basically, what's happened to Julian Assange, what happens to marginalized politicians. It can have profound and far-reaching implications. I don't mean to sound like the Washington Post editorial board now, but for our democracy, right? Which is, on the one hand, we're marginalizing, prosecuting, and destroying physically, mentally, and certainly reputationally someone like Julian Assange for bringing facts to the public. On the other hand, we have a media, on the second hand, we have a media that seems willing and capable, a mainstream media, of marginalizing everyone that is outside a prescribed set of norms. I thought of bringing in like Rob Reiner and the Hamilton Project to this conversation because they have partners outside as well, cooperating with this, and the social media, which is, maybe you'll come back and talk about that at some point. But you have all of these forces basically enforcing, putting us all in a box and saying you can't go outside of this box in the discourse, but they're tampering with highly explosive material, whether it's in terms of our freedom of speech or in terms of unanticipated outcomes, including the presidency of Donald Trump. I guess that's where I'm leaving it. And if you have any closing thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything you're saying is right. If you just look at the history of people like Assange or Ed Snowden, these are people whose crime, and it's a crime to the extent that we're talking about people who are physically in jail or in exile permanently, right? I mean, we're not talking about a little bit of public shaming here. We're talking about right. Literally a crime is telling the truth, and it's not just those two. It's people like John Kiriakou, the former CIA official, right. Or Chelsea Manning, or countless other. There are a series of intelligence community whistleblowers who've gotten into very serious trouble. And our message is those people are to be reviled for telling us the truth about things. Meanwhile, the people that they were telling us the truth about, intelligence chiefs who might have committed perjury openly in Congress, are now all over the news. They're paid contributors on all the cable channels. And in between, what we have is this co-opted commercial news media, which has completely lost its sense of mission. And again, I hate to keep going back to this and sounding like an old fogey, but there used to be a very, very powerful ethos in this industry about the press maintaining its independence and distance from its subject, because that's all of our institutional power comes from our ability to be seen as an impartial observer. And then once we cross that boundary and lose that sense of distance, we lose all of our authority with audiences, which creates this situation that we have now where nobody trusts the media, nobody knows what to believe, which, has, I think you're right, has very dramatic consequences for democracy. Like, if you can't have an informed populace, how do people vote accurately? Well, what are they voting on? And so this is, I think you're right. It's a very, very serious issue. It's underplayed in the press, I think, for obvious reasons. But yeah, I don't think it's underplayed by the general public. I think they're paying a lot of attention to this, and it's a mistake to overlook that.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but I'm glad you're reporting on this stuff. We didn't even get to talk about Michael Flynn, but it's a good example of everything we're talking about. So, Matt Taibbi, I guess people can find you at taibbi.substack.com. Is that the best place to look?
Yep, and also at Rolling Stone, I still write for the magazine, and we have a podcast there called Useful Idiots. It comes out once a week. So yeah, check us out there too.
Check them all out. All right, okay. And as always, Matt Taibbi, thanks for coming on the program.
Richard, thanks very much. Wish you good health.